PreWrath places a great deal of importance on a seeming parallel between Revelation 6 and 7 and Matthew 24. But a closer look shows that this supposed parallel is nothing to write home about, to say the least. I'll explain all about this in a minute. The movie 7 Pre-Trib Problems places a great deal of importance on a seeming parallel between Revelation 6 and 7 and Matthew 24. This, they say, proves pre-wrath to be right and pre-trib to be wrong.
Another line of evidence for the pre-wrath position in Revelation 6 comes from the recognition that the 6 seals line up perfectly with the teaching of Christ during his Olivet Discourse.
Alan Haltberg presents it in a bit more detail here.
The opening of the seals is parallel to the elements of Jesus' discussion in Matthew 24. So the rider on the white horse corresponds to the false Christs. The rider on the red horse is war. The black horse is famine. The sickly horse is death. And then there's martyrs.
And Ryan Habena says it's a key part of pre-wrath rapture and was key to him coming into the pre-wrath position.
Revelation 6 is a revelation to a lot of people when you start to compare it to Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse. And this is a very key part of pre-wrath rapturism. It's actually something that was key to me really coming into the position. Juxtaposing both the flow of Matthew 24 and Revelation chapter 6 shows a lot of parallels.
If this is the case, obviously it must be a very convincing piece of evidence for pre-wrath. So I decided to look into it myself. From an initial reading I thought not everything works out that well, but I thought I'd give it a chance. Good theories can often be slighted on small details, but they should be given a chance if the big pieces fit in place. I was determined then to make it work just like it's shown in the movie, with all the colors, like this. I had my table in front of me with 2 columns and the 2 passages written in there, one on each side, and I honestly tried to make things fit. I was expecting to find myself saying, okay, you win, 1-0 for you on this one. But it isn't so. And if someone's looking for the parallels and can't find them, that says something. I tell you, I racked my brains trying to make it fit, but I couldn't. I tried and I failed. And I'm tired and weary.
I tried and I failed, and I'm tired and weary.
I looked at different pre-wrath materials. Chris White, one of the foremost pre-wrathers today, wrote an article entitled, Wow, comparing Matthew 24 to Revelation 6. Then there's the widely circulated The Case for Pre-Wrath Rapture by Kenneth Eckerty. But when I realized the different pre-wrathers don't agree among themselves on it, and I was trying to correlate their data too, it was becoming a mess, and I just felt it was becoming too much for me.
But it was too much for me.
Eventually I managed to get through it. Judge for yourselves and see if the supported parallels are as amazing as they claim to be. But before I continue, I just want to say that even though I'm sarcastic in these videos about pre-wrath theory, my working assumption is that the pre-wrathers, especially the ones in 7 Pre-Trib Problems, are brothers in Christ and that they believe in the gospel. So now let's head on for the parallels. First seal. The first seal is called the white horse, and that's in Revelation 6, 1 and 2. The white horse is the Antichrist, and that's supposed to parallel the false Christ Jesus warns about in Matthew 24 verse 5. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. So Antichrist is paralleled with false Christs. Have you fallen off your seats yet? I haven't either. The first time I heard this parallel, I thought, For one thing, the Antichrist is described in Revelation 6:2 as a conqueror, a warrior, one who sweeps through vast areas, taking control, subduing the whole world under himself, a type of Napoleon or Alexander the Great. But pre-wrath compares him to false Christs, in plural, of which there were many, starting with Bar Kokhba and his revolt, and ending with people like Jim Jones in our day. In Revelation, it's speaking about the vast conquests made by one man. Please take into account that it says in Daniel 7:23 that his kingdom will devour the whole earth. And in Matthew, it's a warning about multiple people claiming to be Christ and warning against them. Come on, this is not the same thing. Now, Kenneth Eckerty, whose document The Case for PreWrath is widely circulated, gives away this weakness by saying the comparison would be shaky if that's all we had. Now, he's right. It is shaky, and that's right at the onset of the so-called parallels. The rest of the parallels would have to prove themselves as strong parallels for us to forego the weakness of this one. So the score for the first supposed parallel is 1, very weak. The second parallel is the second seal, the red horse of Revelation 6 verses 3 and 4. The second parallel is probably the strongest one. It's the great sword when peace is removed from the earth. And the parallel in Matthew 24 verses 6 and 7 is, indeed, war. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. If all the parallels were as strong as this one, PreWrath would have one strong point. Now, it is true that when Revelation says people should kill one another, it doesn't necessarily have to mean war, but could well mean what it means in Genesis 6:11, where it says, the earth was filled with violence, i.e., people were violent toward each other, but without ongoing wars. But given that the sword often does actually mean war, and Revelation does mention the sword, then this should be regarded as a strong parallel. So the score would be 5, strong. But this is where things start to become weak again. We've arrived at the third so-called parallel, the third seal, the black horse, Revelation 6 verses 5 and 6. The rider on the black horse's back has a pair of scales in his hands, measuring the prices and amounts of wheat and barley. This indicates food shortage and a surge in prices. The equivalent is Matthew 24 verses 7b. And there will be famines. Not bad, right? Well, the verse continues with, and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. If we're going to say this is a parallel, where do the pestilences and earthquakes go? The earthquakes belong more in the sixth seal, where it says there will be a great earthquake, if anything. Now, PreWrathers blame pre-tribbers for ignoring certain problems, but this problem is not addressed at all in Chris White's Wow article that I mentioned before, and neither is it addressed in Eckerty's Case for PreWrath. So I looked at two articles that are supposed to address this, and they're not. Another problem is that the third seal in Revelation doesn't mention hunger specifically, only shortage and a surge in prices. And that is as opposed to the fourth seal, with which we'll deal next, which does specify hunger. So making the fourth seal a parallel with this, with the famines, would be better. But if we reassign things to another seal, it will scramble the parallels, so that step is avoided. So I'm sorry to say, the score for this one will be 3, so-so, or let's be generous, so-so plus. That would mean 3 plus. We get to the fourth parallel, the fourth seal, the pale horse. Revelation 6 verses 7 and 8. The pale green horse is where PreWrathers run into more trouble, and the creative solutions they try to come up with are rather pathetic. Revelation says, behold a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with a sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Understood? A fourth of the earth's population, that is, 1 in 4 people, is killed by several means, including the sword, hunger, and wild animals. It doesn't say it's a form of persecution, or that the people being killed are believers, or anything like that. Any quarter of the population will do for this killing. Now let's look at Matthew's supposed parallel according to PreWrath in verses 9 and 10. It doesn't work out at all. It says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. This is talking about persecution of believers, and probably even Jewish believers, in the end times. Do believers comprise 25% of the world's population? Not by any means, quite far from it. Eckerty, the one who wrote the case for PreWrath, tries to supplement and include all Christianity, including Catholics, to make up the 25% of the Earth's population. But Catholics are just as damned as any secular person. They are not redeemed or saved. They are not born again. Has PreWrath become ecumenical just to create a parallel? Alan Kirshner agrees with Eckerty that the fourth seal is the persecution of the saints. But it doesn't say that. It just says that a fourth of humanity is killed. Kirshner says this: "It is my contention that the fourth seal reflects the consequences of refusing to take the Antichrist's mark." Question: is there the slightest indication that the death of a quarter of society is dealing with saints for refusing the mark? No. This interpretation is completely forced upon the text. And Kirshner too tries to supplement the numbers by saying it might be referring to Christendom in general, and concludes by saying, "I suggest that the fourth seal represents a choice people must make, Antichrist or Jesus Christ." Proof? Basis? Anything? Nothing. What about Chris White's Wow article? It doesn't address the 25% of society at all. Maybe he deals with this in another place, but not there. However, he does try to make a parallel by eliminating the mention of wild beasts. Look at this. The Greek for wild beasts, he says, should be translated beast, i.e. the Antichrist, he says. Therefore, all the death mentioned there is orchestrated by the beast, the Antichrist. Wild beasts, he says, is simply a wrong translation of the Greek. Alan Kirshner says basically the same thing. Now, whenever someone pulls the but the Greek says trick on you, you know that the text is not saying what they want it to say. The but the Greek says is a common trick, but it shouldn't fool you or anyone. If the text you're reading doesn't say what you want it to say, you can always search the lexicons for alternative meanings to make the text say what you want it to say. But you see, an awful lot of work goes into each Bible translation. Except the Message and the Passion, of course. Okay, the translations, they have committees with Greek and Hebrew scholars advising them the whole time. Try the Bible Hub page for Revelation 6, verse 8. Can you find a handful of reputable translations saying the beast instead of just wild beasts or wild animals? Perhaps one translation would suggest so. No, not at all. That means you have to either take Chris White's and Alan Kirshner's word for it, because they're better Greek scholars than any Bible committee could ever come up with, or rather, they're pulling the but the Greek says trick on you. PreWrathers are correct when they say that pre-tribbers shouldn't translate apostasia as the rapture in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I agree with them, but then why are PreWrathers engaging in the same tactics? I mailed this to a friend who's good at Greek. He told me insisting that wild beasts is referring to the beast is barbaric Greek. Laughable. Hard to believe that pre-Wrath rapture advocates could stoop so low. End of quote. Now the normal translation that all the translations give, wild beasts, does actually make perfect sense. First of all, in times of famine, the animals suffered too, and they start contending for food together with humans. Even during these unnecessary COVID-19 lockdowns, we've seen an increase in wild beasts entering the cities, and that's without great famine. It also corresponds with the end time scene recorded in Amos 5 verses 18 and 19, where it says, "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord! For what good is the day of the Lord to you? It will be darkness and not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or as though he went into the house, leaned his hand on the wall, and a serpent bit him." We see beasts are going wild during the day of the Lord, and it fits with what we read in Revelation, so there's no surprise here. In any case, all the maneuvers the PreWrathers are doing, whether including Catholics in their schemes to make up the 25% of the world's population, or changing the meaning of words, all of these show that they're trying to force fit this into being a parallel when it's not a parallel at all. a quarter of the population dying from the sword, from hunger and wild beasts, is not the persecution of believers mentioned in Matthew 24, verses 9 and 10. So the score for this supposed parallel is 1. Miserable. And now the fifth seal, the martyrs under the altar. Revelation 6, verses 9 to 11. The cry of the martyrs is actually where I would place the persecuted believers of Matthew 24, which we just discussed. Anyone with a keen eye will see that that's the true parallel if there was one. But making these two parallels would scramble things up for PreWrath, so again we resort to force-fitting for the sake of maintaining PreWrath. This seal, the fifth seal, says the martyrs under the altar are asking God how long it will be until he avenges their blood. Now the PreWrathers make a great deal out of this, claiming this clearly shows that God's wrath has not begun yet. Kirshner says the martyrs are asking their sovereign God when his wrath will be poured out to vindicate them. And Cooper from the 7 Problems video does the same. Look at this.
They ask God, when are you going to start your wrath on the people on the earth who are responsible for our death? That is powerful in my opinion, because to me that explicitly declares that the wrath of God, that eschatological wrath, has not begun.
Now notice, the passage doesn't say they're asking God, when are you going to start your wrath? That's putting words in their mouths. It only states that the persecutors of these martyrs have not been punished yet. That's why they're asking, when will you judge and avenge our blood? God is waiting a little more until he deals with these persecutors. It's a bit similar to God stating that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete in Genesis 15:16. Sometimes God waits longer than we would with revenge. Surprisingly enough, PreWrathers equate this passage of the cry of the martyrs with Matthew 24 verses 15 and 16, where Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation at the midpoint of the 70th week and the flight of the Judean Jews to the mountains. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Again, a question. Is there any indication whatsoever that the cry of the martyrs in the fifth seal parallels the setting up of the abomination of desolation and the flight of the Jews? No, not at all. Now, isn't that a bit odd, taking into account that the setting up of the abomination of desolation is one of the most important events in prophecy? Of course it's odd, because the fifth seal is not at all dealing with the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation and the flight of the Jews are both dealt with at length much later on in the sequence of events in Revelation, where they belong in chapters 12 and 13. If you haven't watched our video on the sequentiality of Revelation, please follow the link above and see how clearly the book of Revelation is set out and how PreWrathers do their best to scramble it in order to fit in a PreWrath rapture scheme. The fifth seal is not dealing with the abomination of desolation. It's right at the beginning of the tribulation period, the beginning of the 70th week. It's not a parallel to the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24, not at all. Now, in Chris White's Wow article, when writing about Matthew 24's abomination of desolation, he says, the entire section here is telling people to flee because of the persecution that will start at that point. Telling people to flee. I like the way in which this theory that makes razor-sharp distinctions where unnecessary suddenly becomes very vague when it comes to definitions that don't help their theory. The Matthew passage is not telling people to flee. It's telling those who are in Judea to flee to the mountains. Those who are in Judea means those who are in Judea. That means Jews or Jewish believers. Where is it telling them to flee? Flee to the mountains. It's not telling the Swiss to run to the Alps or those in Tennessee to run to the Smokies. It's telling those who are in Judea to flee to the mountains because they have a place prepared for them where they will be nourished for 3.5 years. That's in Revelation 12. I've dealt with this in the video on tribulation saints, and I wish the church would stop seeing itself in that passage. So White and other PreWrathers generalize this tribulation passage from dealing with Israel as though it's dealing with believers in general for two reasons. To blur the distinction between Israel and the church, because any such distinction is unhelpful to pre-wrath rapturism, and to make this passage look like a parallel to the fifth seal. But in essence, it's not a parallel at all. So I go to Alan Kirshner, and what does he say? Well, look at the parallels table, which is the same that you'll find in his book, but we've seen it in the video. Look at this spot right here. See the skip in verses? Do you know what's in those skipped verses? The abomination of desolation section. It's entirely missing in his parallel. One of the most important events in prophecy, smack, gone. Why? Because it doesn't fit in the parallel. This speaks volumes about their supposed parallels. It's just not working. So the score for this one would be also 1. Very weak. So we're progressing, we're in the sixth seal, cosmic events. Revelation 6 verses 12 to 17. Okay, the sixth seal is actually one of PreWrath's strongest cards, probably the strongest. True, it has its own problems, but when taken on its own, it can be convincing. The sixth seal in Revelation 6 verses 12 to 17 says there'll be a great earthquake, the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, the moon became like blood, the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. The sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up. Every mountain and island was moved out of its place. And in Matthew 24 and verse 29 it's written, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken. True, there are some dissimilarities here. The things I've marked in red, like the great earthquake, the mountains and islands moving out of their places, and the sky receding as a scroll, are not all mentioned in Matthew. Moreover, a blood-red moon is not the same as a moon not giving its light at all. But these differences should be overlooked if the big pieces fit in place, and, on the whole, this should be considered a good, strong parallel. However, and this is where I say, however, this parallel doesn't come without a large cost to the general scheme of things, a cost that PreWrathers are quite willing to pay. Let me explain. First of all, the timing is awkward. It's downright awkward. PreWrath is the only scheme that places Christ's second coming in glory at around the 3/4 point of the 70th week. Apart from being awkward, it also doesn't make any scriptural sense. Why? Because according to Daniel 7, the Antichrist prevails against the saints for a time and times and half a time, the full length of 3.5 years, until the Ancient of Days came. This means Christ comes right at the end of the 70th week, and not at the 3/4 point of the 70th week, as PreWrathers claim. And it fully ties in with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where it's written, the Lord will consume the Antichrist with the breath of his mouth and destroy him with the brightness of his coming. We learn from Revelation 19 that this is done by his casting him alive into the lake of fire in verse 20. And this occurs right at the very end of the 70th week. All other rapture models, pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, all rightfully place this event right at the end of the 70th week, after the mourning of the tribes of Israel, which itself occurs at the end of the 70th week. So no, the Olivet Discourse is not cut short with the rapture at the 3/4 point of the 70th week, as the PreWrath model has it. Jesus in the Olivet Discourse gives an overview that spans the entire 70th week, culminating in his second coming in glory. The second coming in glory is not at the 3/4 point as PreWrath says it is. And there are other substantial reasons why the second coming of Christ in glory simply cannot occur at the 3/4 point of the 70th week where the PreWrathers place it, but will suffice with these for now, okay? So to answer the similarity between the sixth seal cosmic events with those of Matthew 24, it's important to understand that the 70th week is characterized by cosmic events. For instance, in Luke 21, In a passage associated with the first 3.5 years, with the beginning of travail, it says there will be fearful sights and great signs, in plural, from heaven. So there are quite a few during the 70th week, and let me give a quick rundown of what we have. First of all, there's the sixth seal, which has a black sun, a blood moon, falling stars, and the sky receding like a scroll. Now, according to PreWrath, this is the same sign as in Joel 2, but this is problematic for reasons we won't discuss right now. I think Joel 2 happens before the 70th week, before the day of the Lord, but we won't get into this right now. Secondly, in the fourth trumpet, you have a third part of the light darkened, so obviously things have brightened up since the sixth seal for there to be a third part darkened, right? Then in the fifth trumpet, the sun is darkened from the smoke of the pit. Again, if the sun is darkened, then it was probably lit again after the previous darkening. Then you've got the fourth bowl, which is a scorching sun, which means the sun is probably at full light or more. Then you've got the fifth bowl, where the kingdom of the beast is darkened, which means the sun is darkened again. And lastly, you've got Matthew 24, a darkened sun, black moon, stars falling, and powers of heaven shaken. This is the sign of Christ's second coming, right at the end of the 70th week. So when we see all of these cosmic events happening during the 70th week, we understand the cosmic events of the sixth seal and the ones mentioned in Matthew 24 are definitely similar, but they are speaking of two different events occurring at two different times, a few years apart from each other. The cosmic events in Revelation in the sixth seal are among the first in a series of cosmic events, and the ones in Matthew 24 occur right at the very end of the 70th week. They're not happening at the same time. So one would ask, how then would believers know which is the sign of Christ's second coming? Well, the cosmic events of Matthew 24 are the only cosmic events of their kind to occur after the abomination of desolation, which is a major marker. And this makes those cosmic events unmistakable for believers living at that time. So to cap this one up, the sixth seal and the celestial signs in Matthew 24 are not a bad parallel at all. But it comes at a great cost to the overall picture by forcing one to reposition the second coming in glory to somewhere other than the end of the 70th week where it belongs, and bring the Olivet discourse to an abrupt stop before reaching the end of the 70th week. I find this very awkward. However, I will try to show the kind of fairness I don't expect to receive back from PreWrathers by ignoring all the surrounding considerations and regarding it strictly as a parallel. And in this case, the score for this parallel would be 5 strong. Now we got to the last parallel, the great multitude in heaven. Now before we touch on this parallel, I just want to say that during the sixth seal, the kings of the earth and others hide themselves in terror, crying that the great day of his wrath has come. That's in chapter 6 and verses 15 to 17. And this leads PreWrathers to the conclusion that God's wrath has not yet started. I'll get to that later. From this point, they continue to the great multitude in heaven, which is in chapter 7, and they're standing in white robes before the throne. When asked who this multitude is, the answer is that these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation. This shows clearly, PreWrathers say, that the saints have been raptured, and now the wrath can start, since we're not appointed to wrath. Which is a true point, by the way. We're not appointed to wrath, but they say, see, now they've been raptured, so the wrath can start. The great multitude in heaven, the PreWrathers say, parallels the rapture in Matthew 24 verse 31, where it's written, "And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Is this a strong parallel? Well, no, it isn't. A few points. Firstly, it's not the rapture that is spoken of in Matthew 24 and verse 31. It's the gathering of God's elect people, Israel. Turn to Deuteronomy 30 and see in verses 3 and 4 that this is speaking about Israel. "Then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee," this is clearly about Israel, "and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee. If any of thine be driven out, unto the uttermost parts of heaven. From thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. When the Lord says the angels will gather together his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other, he is using that exact same terminology of gathering an earthly people from the four winds of heaven. As we've said, this gathering of Israel happens after the mourning of Israel, right at the end of the 70th week, and is the climax of the whole tribulation period. In fact, it's one of the purposes of the tribulation period, to bring Israel to repentance and to restore them spiritually and physically back to the land. Secondly, the Lord's coming is not even mentioned in the sixth seal in Revelation and later, but only right at the end of Revelation in chapter 19, where it naturally belongs in the sequence of events. How would this event, the most important of all prophetic events, be overlooked in the sixth seal and go without a mention? Obviously, the sixth seal is not Jesus' second coming. I repeat, the sixth seal is not Jesus' second coming. And lastly, we are not told that the great multitude in heaven has been raptured there. That is only derived, conjectured, but it's not stated in the text at all. These saints might well have been martyred. If indeed the Great Tribulation continues until the end of the 70th week, as all the other models agree, then this scene is simply a glimpse of those saints in heaven who have been martyred up to that point, while the Great Tribulation is still going on. And let me say that in any case, even if the multitude in heaven was describing a rapture, and it's not, but let's say it was, then it has nothing to do with the gathering at the end of the 70th week described in Matthew 24. The gathering in Matthew 24 is speaking about the gathering of Israel from the four winds of heaven, as stated in Deuteronomy 30 verses 3 and 4. So the score for this parallel, I'm sorry to say, is 2. Quite weak. So what with the kings of the earth saying, the great day of his wrath has come? What do we make of that? Does that mean that up to that point the wrath hasn't come yet, like PreWrathers say? Well, no, it's pretty clear that the wrath has been happening, and Revelation starting from the first verses in chapter 6 describe the wrath of God. So why do they say the great day of his wrath has come? Alan Haltberg gives an explanation in the 7 Pre-Trib Problems video, and here it is.
Pre-tribulationists generally want to argue the day of the Lord began with the first seal, and so when people say the great day of God's wrath has arrived, all they're doing is finally recognizing that they've been experiencing the great day of God's wrath.
Exactly. The wrath of God has started with the first seal, just as Alan Haltberg puts it, and finally the kings of the earth are realizing that this is the day of God's wrath. You can explain peace being taken away from the earth and great wars happening. You can explain hunger, disease, famine. You can even explain a quarter of the population of the earth dying, because that has happened before in the bubonic plague. But it's hard to explain the sixth seal. When you see not only the sun become black, but the moon become like blood, and the stars falling from heaven, and the sky receding like a scroll, and every mountain and island moving out of its place, boy, that is scary. I mean, that's when excuses have finished. Up to now, stubborn people can say things happen, but at this point there is no denying that this is God's wrath, and they realize it and they're scared. So yes, Alan Haltberg's explanation is the classic pre-trib explanation, and that's the one that I agree with. So just to sum it up, all in all, the parallels PreWrathers draw between Revelation 6 and 7 and Matthew 24 are mostly very weak, and therefore these two passages should not be considered as parallel at all. But the cosmic events of the sixth seal, coupled with a seeming rapture before the opening of the seventh seal, are actually PreWrath's strongest point. However, as we've said, in order to maintain this point, PreWrathers are quite willing to overlook many crucial details and scramble the logic and the timing of other clear events in other passages of Scripture, and they do so to the point of awkwardness. And this is without mentioning that if you try and make Revelation 6 parallel with Luke 21, which is also the Olivet Discourse, it scrambles all the parallels completely, further proving that this is no parallel. But then Luke 21 poses so many problems for PreWrath, it's a subject on its own. We've only made one video about it, it deserves at least one more, and I hope to deal with it at a later date. So up to now I just want to say, I hope you have not been too confused by PreWrath. Pretrib is the best model out there for the timing of the rapture. It takes all the data into account in the best way possible. PreWrath in comparison is a very awkward model with lots of cuts and pastes and I don't know what. I wouldn't go for PreWrath if I were you. Pretrib is still the best model out there. So may God bless you and see you up in the air.